Imagine getting your dream job. Good pay, fun coworkers, and a perk nobody else in the world had. You literally glowed in the dark. We're talking walking home from your shift glowing under the streetlights, painting your teeth before a dance so your smile lit up the room, your clothes, your hair, your skin, all of it softly, beautifully luminous. Women were lining up for this job. In the 1920s, radium was not a warning. It was a fashion. Radium toothpaste, radium face cream, radium health drinks people chugged every morning. The most glamorous element on Earth. The executives at U.S. Radium Corporation called their paint Undark and their workers the Ghost Girls. It was a compliment. These young women thought they were living the dream. They had no idea that the radium was quietly mistaking their bones for calcium and settling inside their skeletons forever. That every time they pointed their brushes with their lips, they were swallowing a substance 1 million times more radioactive than uranium. That their jaws were about to start crumbling, one by one, at the dentist's touch. And the people who ran the company, the executives, the scientists, the Harvard doctor they paid, they knew. They wore lead aprons and used tongs to handle the same paint they told their workers was harmless. They called it safe to the girls' faces, while protecting themselves behind their backs. This is the story of the Radium Girls, and I promise you, by the time this is over, you are going to be furious. Subscribe and hit the bell before we start, because unlike the Radium Girls, at least you'll know it's coming. Let's go. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand how this happened, you have to understand the world it happened in. In 1898, a Polish-French scientist named Marie Curie, working with her husband Pierre, discovered a new element. They extracted it from a mineral called pitchblende, and when they finally isolated it, it did something that no material anyone had ever seen could do. It glowed on its own, a faint, eerie blue-green light coming from nothing, powered by nothing anyone could see. They named it radium, from the Latin word for ray, and the world completely lost its mind. Because here's the thing about radium that you have to understand. To people in the early 20th century, this was not a dangerous substance. This was magic. This was the future. A material that produced its own light, that gave off heat, that seemed to contain some kind of boundless, invisible energy. People did not look at that and feel fear. They looked at that and felt wonder. And then they started putting it in everything, and I do mean everything. There was radium toothpaste, marketed to give you a brighter smile, which technically I suppose it would. There was radium face cream that promised to make your skin glow with youth and vitality. There was radium soap, radium hair tonic. There were radium chocolate bars sold in Germany. There was a radium energy drink called Radithor, which was just radium dissolved in water that wealthy people drank by the bottle, believing it would boost their health. There were radium suppositories, which I am not going to describe further. You can use your imagination. Radium was sold as a cure for arthritis, high blood pressure, impotence, aging, and basically anything else you could think of. It was in cosmetics, in medicines, in tonics, in cleaning products. The word radium on a label meant modern, premium, healthy, cutting edge. It was the wellness trend of its era, except the thing at the center of the trend was one of the most dangerous substances humanity had ever isolated. And almost nobody knew. The reason radium seemed safe is that the dangers of radiation were truly not understood yet. Marie Curie herself, the woman who discovered it, carried test tubes of radioactive material around in her pockets and kept them in her desk drawer because she liked the way they glowed in the dark. Her notebooks from the 1890s are still so radioactive today that they are kept in lead-lined boxes, and researchers who want to look at them have to sign a waiver. Marie Curie eventually died of aplastic anemia, almost certainly caused by her decades of radiation exposure. The discoverer of radium was killed by radium. That is how little anyone understood about what they were dealing with. So when a company figured out that you could mix radium with a chemical called zinc sulfide to create a glowing paint, a paint that would shine in the dark for years without any power source, it did not seem sinister at all. It seemed like a miracle, a useful, beautiful, profitable miracle. And in 1917, with America entering the First World War, that glowing paint was about to become very, very important, because soldiers in the trenches needed to read their watches in the dark. and someone was going to have to paint those watches. So let's talk about the factories. The first major radium dial painting operation in the United States was set up by a company that would eventually become the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, starting around 1917. A second major operation opened in Ottawa, Illinois, run by the Radium Dial Company in the early 1920s, and there was a third in Waterbury, Connecticut. These factories had a very specific hiring need. Painting the tiny numbers on a watch dial, numbers smaller than a grain of rice, required delicate hands, good eyesight, and fine motor control. So they hired young women, lots of them. Teenagers mostly, some as young as 14, 15, 16 years old, along with women in their 20s. And here is something important to understand about why these jobs were so desirable. This was extremely well-paid work. A dial painter could earn 3 times what the average working woman made. The very best painters could earn more in a year than their fathers did. For a working-class girl in the 1920s, this was a dream job. It was clean, it was respectable, it paid astonishingly well, and it was considered skilled artistic work. Management literally called the women artists. Girls would recruit their sisters, their cousins, their best friends. Whole groups of friends worked side by side. Sisters worked together. It was social, it was fun, and it made them the envy of every other girl in town. And then there was the magic of it. They were working with glowing paint. The whole studio glowed. The air was full of fine radium dust that settled on everything, their hair, their clothes, their skin. At the end of a shift, the women would walk home and they would glow in the dark. They thought it was wonderful. They would wear their good dresses to work so the dresses would glow at dances later. They painted their nails with it. They painted their teeth with it before a night out so their smile would light up. One woman painted a glowing mustache on herself to make her friends laugh. Another painted glowing designs on her face. They were teenagers. They thought they had the coolest job in the world. Why wouldn't they? Now here is the detail that makes this entire story so horrifying, and it is the detail that everyone fixates on when they first hear this story, because it is the mechanism by which these women were poisoned. To paint those tiny numbers precisely, you needed an extremely fine point on your brush. The camel hair brushes they used would lose their shape after a few strokes, so the women needed a way to keep repointing the bristles into a sharp tip. And the technique they were taught, the technique the company instructed them to use, was to put the brush in their mouth. Lip, dip, paint. You point the brush with your lips, you dip it in the radium paint, you paint the number. Then you point it with your lips again, dip, paint. Hundreds of times a day. A skilled painter could do over 250 dials in a day with 12 numbers on each dial. That is thousands of times a day that these women put a radium-soaked brush directly into their mouths and swallowed a little bit of radium with each pass. When some of the women asked if this was safe, and some of them did ask, they were told it was completely harmless. One trainer who started in 1916 asked her supervisor whether the lip pointing was dangerous and was told confidently that it was safe, that it might even be good for her, put a little color in her cheeks. Remember, radium was being sold as a health product, so why wouldn't it be safe to swallow a little? The women had no reason to doubt it. They trusted the company. They trusted that no employer would ask them to do something that would hurt them. They were young, and they were earning more money than they had ever dreamed of, doing skilled artistic work that made them glow like something out of a fairy tale. There was no reason on earth to suspect that the magic glowing paint was with every single brush stroke, every lip point, every dip, slowly and permanently settling into their bones. By the time the first symptoms appeared, these women had been swallowing radium thousands of times a day for years. The dose was enormous, and radium, once it's inside you, does not leave. It finds your bones, it mistakes itself for calcium, it settles in, and it stays there, firing radiation into your body for the rest of your life, which, for many of these women, was not going to be very long at all. So let's talk about what radium actually does to the human body, because understanding the science makes everything that follows so much worse. When you swallow radium, your body does something deeply tragic with it. Radium sits in the same column of the periodic table as calcium. Chemically, they look very similar to your body. So when radium enters your bloodstream, your body gets confused. It looks at the radium and goes, "Oh, calcium. Great, I know exactly what to do with this, and it sends it straight to your bones. Think about that for a second. Your body takes the single most dangerous thing you could possibly put into it and actively files it away into your skeleton, treating it like a building material. It deposits it in your jaw, your teeth, your spine, your hips, your skull, and then it locks it in there, permanently. And here is the part that turns this from a poisoning into a horror story. Radium is radioactive. It is constantly, every second of every day, firing off alpha particles. Now, alpha radiation is actually quite weak in terms of penetration. It can't even get through your skin from the outside. A sheet of paper can stop it, which is exactly why the danger was so hidden. Holding a vial of radium was relatively safe. The radiation couldn't get through your skin. But once that radium is inside you, lodged in your bones, there is no skin to protect the tissue. The alpha particles are firing directly into your living bone, your bone marrow, your blood cells at point-blank range from the inside 24 hours a day for years. It's like having a microscopic machine gun embedded in your skeleton that never stops firing and never runs out of ammunition. The radium was, quite literally, drilling microscopic holes in their bones from the inside out. The bone tissue began to die. The jaw, where a lot of the radium settled because the women were putting the brushes in their mouths, was hit especially hard. The bone started to decay and rot while the women were still alive. And because radium also poisons bone marrow, which is where your body makes blood, the women developed severe anemia because their own bones could no longer produce healthy blood. Now here is the part that should make you angry. Because while the women painting the dials had absolutely no idea any of this was happening, the people running the company were not entirely in the dark. Let me be precise about this because it matters. In the very early years, around 1917 to 1920, it is entirely possible that nobody fully understood the danger. The science of radioactivity was young, but that excuse evaporates quickly. Because the executives and the scientists at these companies took precautions to protect themselves long before they did anything to protect the workers. At the United States Radium Corporation, the chemists and executives who handled raw radium used lead screens, they used tongs to handle the material, they wore lead aprons. The founder of the company, a chemist named Sabin von Sichaki, actually had part of his own finger amputated due to radium exposure. He, of all people, knew the stuff was dangerous. The men in the laboratory understood that radium needed to be handled with extreme care, and in the very same buildings, the young women in the painting studio were putting it in their mouths hundreds of times a day and being told it was harmless. The people who knew enough to protect themselves did not extend that knowledge to the women whose work was making them rich. As one person put it, reflected on this story years later, and I think this captures it perfectly, quote, "Just realizing they knew. There's no two ways about it. It was a total cover-up." And another, even more bluntly, American capitalism at its finest. Now you might be thinking, surely once women started getting sick, someone connected the dots immediately. You would think so. But the way the truth came out was slow and ugly and full of people actively trying to bury it. Because by the early 1920s, the women had started to get sick, and what happened to them and what the company did when it started happening is where this story goes from a tragedy to something that will truly make your blood boil. It started, for many of them, with a toothache. Her name was Amelia Maggia, but everyone called her Molly. She worked at the Radium factory in Orange, New Jersey, painting watch dials with her sisters. She was young. She was, by every account, full of life. And in 1921, she got a toothache. Now, a toothache is the most ordinary thing in the world. She went to the dentist, and the dentist pulled the bad tooth. But the spot where the tooth had been didn't heal. Instead, it became a painful ulcer, oozing and bleeding. Then the tooth next to it started to hurt, so that one was pulled too. And that socket didn't heal either. The infection, or what looked like an infection, began to spread through her mouth and her jaw. Her dentist was baffled. He had never seen anything like it. The ulcers spread. Her breath became foul. She was in constant, escalating pain. Over the following months, Molly Maggia's condition became a nightmare that no one could explain or stop. Her teeth kept failing. The tissue in her mouth was dying. And then came the moment that once you hear it, you never forget. During one examination, her dentist reached into her mouth to check her jaw, and her entire lower jawbone simply broke apart in his fingers. He didn't pull it out with force, he lifted it out. Her jaw had disintegrated to the point that it came away in his hand. This is the detail that stops people cold when they first learn this story. Her jaw didn't break, it dissolved. The radium had eaten her jawbone away from the inside until there was barely anything left holding it together. And Molly was still alive through all of this, fully conscious, living it. The radium then continued its work on the rest of her. It attacked her body relentlessly. The tissues of her throat began to break down, and on September 12, 1922, Molly Magia died at just 24 years old when the radium had so destroyed the blood vessels in her throat that she suffered a massive hemorrhage. She bled to death. She was the first of the dial painters to die. She would be very far from the last. But here's the detail about Molly's death that tells you everything about what these women were up against. When Molly Magia died, the cause of death listed on her certificate was not radium poisoning. It was not the mysterious bone disease that had destroyed her jaw. The official cause of death recorded for Molly Magia was syphilis. Let that sink in. This young woman was poisoned to death by her employer's product, and the record of her death was used to imply that she was sexually promiscuous, that her own behavior, her own supposed immorality had killed her. Now, whether this was a deliberate smear at the moment of her death or a genuine misdiagnosis is debated, but what is not debated is that the syphilis explanation became extremely convenient for the company later on, because when the other women started getting sick and questions started being asked, the company and its defenders had a ready-made explanation that put the blame on the women themselves. Oh, it's not the radium. These girls have loose morals. It's a venereal disease. It was a way of weaponizing the social shame of the era against dying women to protect a corporation's bottom line. And it worked for a while. It kept people from looking too closely. It made the sick women ashamed and isolated. Imagine being slowly killed by your job and having the people responsible suggest that your own promiscuity was to blame. The author who documented these women's stories said the thing that makes her most angry is exactly this, that they tried to slut-shame the women, hiring private investigators to dig up dirt on them, asserting that some of them died of sexually transmitted diseases. These women were dying in the most horrific way imaginable, and the response was to attack their reputations. Meanwhile, more and more of them were falling ill. Molly's own sisters, who had painted dials beside her, would later suffer too. Across the factory, women who had worked together, laughed together, glowed together at dances, were now developing the same impossible symptoms: the toothaches, the failing jaws, the exhaustion, the anemia. Something was very clearly, very horribly wrong, and a few people were starting to pay attention. The person who really started connecting the dots was not a doctor or a scientist. It was a statistician. In the early 1920s, a man named Frederick Hoffman, working for an insurance company, began investigating the strange cluster of illnesses among the dial painters. And around the same time, the growing number of sick and dying women was becoming impossible for the company to ignore completely. So, the United States Radium Corporation did something that on the surface looked responsible. They commissioned an independent study. They brought in a respected Harvard physiologist named Cecil Drinker, along with his wife Catherine and a colleague, to investigate the conditions at the factory. And the Drinkers did a thorough job. They examined the plant, they examined the workers, and what they found was alarming. The factory was contaminated. The dust was everywhere. The workers' blood was abnormal. Cecil Drinker concluded that the women's illnesses were almost certainly connected to the radium they were handling. He wrote a report saying exactly that. And here is where it gets deeply sinister. The company received Drinker's report, and then the company essentially rewrote it. When the report was submitted to the New Jersey Department of Labor, the version that the company circulated had been altered. The damning conclusions had been changed. Sections describing the contamination and the abnormal blood results were replaced with language suggesting that the women were in good health and that conditions at the factory were fine. The company took an honest, scientific report that said our factory is poisoning our workers and turned it into a document that said everything is perfectly fine here. They forged the science. They literally falsified a Harvard physiologist's findings to keep the truth buried and keep the women painting. And it might have worked, except for one thing. Cecil Drinker found out. When he discovered that the company had misrepresented his findings, he was furious. His colleague noticed the false information being circulated under his name. And eventually, despite enormous pressure from the company, Drinker published his real, original findings. The truth was now in the scientific record. But the company was not done fighting, not even close. Because even with the science emerging, the company had something incredibly powerful on its side: time and the legal system. You see, the women faced a brutal obstacle that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with the law. In New Jersey, there was a statute of limitations on occupational injury claims. You had 2 years from the date of injury to file a suit. 2 years. But radium poisoning takes years to manifest. The damage was done with every brushstroke, but the symptoms, the failing jaws, the crushing fatigue, the tumors, by the time she understood what had caused it, by the time she could connect it to her old job painting dials, the 2-year window had long since slammed shut. The company knew this, and so one of their strategies was simply to delay, drag everything out, stall, postpone, request continuances, push court dates back. Because every month that passed was another month closer to these women simply dying. And a dead plaintiff was a much cheaper problem than a living one. Think about the calculation being made in those boardrooms. The company's legal strategy was, in part, to run out the clock on the lives of dying women, to delay the proceedings long enough that the plaintiffs would be in their graves before they could ever see justice. It is one of the coldest things you will ever hear about how a corporation responded to having killed its own workers. And remember, this is all happening while these women are in agony, while their jaws are crumbling and their bones are breaking and their bodies are failing. The company's response to the people it had poisoned was to attack their character, falsify the science, and wait for them to die. But they had underestimated the women. Because one of them, a quiet woman named Grace Fryer, was about to decide that she was not going to go quietly. And what she did next changed the course of American history. Before we get to the courtroom, I need you to really understand what was happening to these women's bodies, because the physical reality of radium poisoning is central to understanding why their fight mattered so much and why it took such extraordinary courage. We have talked about the jaw. Radium necrosis of the jaw, radium jaw as it came to be called, was often the first and most visible horror, but it was only the beginning. Once the radium was lodged in the bones, it attacked the entire skeleton, and the results were almost beyond belief. Women developed tumors, not small ones. One of the women, Catherine Donahue, developed a tumor on her hip that grew to the size of a grapefruit. Imagine that growing out of your body while you can do nothing to stop it. The bones themselves became catastrophically fragile. Because the radium was destroying the bone tissue and the body's ability to repair it, the women's skeletons essentially began to crumble under the ordinary stresses of daily life. There are accounts of women whose legs simply broke beneath them while they were walking, just snapped under their own body weight with no fall, no impact. One woman's spine collapsed in on itself. Grace Fryer, the woman who would lead the lawsuit, had her spine so damaged by radium that she had to wear a steel back brace just to sit upright. Her vertebrae were crushing. Another woman, Charlotte Purcell, had her arm amputated in an attempt to stop the spread of the damage. There is a nurse's account of the death of Molly Maggia. When they went to move her body after she died, her remaining bones were so fragile that her hip snapped like a dry twig. Her entire skeleton had become a fragile lattice of fractures. The women shrank. They lost enormous amounts of weight. Catherine Donahue, by the time of her death, weighed barely 60 pounds. They suffered from crushing anemia that left them too weak to stand. Their bodies were quite literally being eaten from the inside by the glowing substance they had once painted on their teeth for fun. And the worst part? They were conscious for all of it. These were not quick deaths. They unfolded over years. And here is something that captures the sheer scale of what was happening and the place where it became most visible. In Ottawa, Illinois, where the Radium Dial Company operated, so many young women in the town got sick and died that the town developed a grim, haunting nickname. It became known as the Town of the Living Dead, or sometimes simply Death City. Think about what that means. This was not one isolated tragedy. This was an entire community where the bright, healthy, glowing girls who had been the envy of everyone were now one by one wasting away, losing their teeth, breaking their bones, and dying young. Mothers, daughters, sisters, best friends. A whole generation of young women in one small town marked for death by the same job. And the company that ran the Ottawa plant, Radium Dial, behaved just as badly as its New Jersey counterpart. They ran advertisements in the local paper reassuring the public and their workers that the work was safe, even after they had internal knowledge that it was not. They actually had the women tested, found evidence of radium poisoning, and never told them the results. They sat on medical tests proving their workers were being poisoned, smiled at those same workers, and let them keep painting. Let me say that again because it is almost too much to believe. The company tested the women, got results showing they were being poisoned, and then deliberately withheld those results from the women so they would keep working. They chose profit over the lives of women they saw every single day. By now, the deaths were mounting. The science was clear. The public was starting to catch on, and a small group of dying women in New Jersey, led by Grace Fryer, had finally found a lawyer willing to take their case. It had taken Grace 2 years just to find an attorney brave enough to go up against the United Radium Corporation, but she had found one, and in 1927 they filed suit. The case of the Radium Girls was about to go public, and the whole country was about to see what had been done to them. The lawsuit that Grace Fryer filed in 1927 included 5 women: Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and 2 sisters, Quinta McDonald and Albina Larice. 5 women, all dying, all former dial painters, all suing the United States Radium Corporation for what it had done to them. The newspapers gave them a name that was as brutal as it was accurate. They called them the case of the 5 women doomed to die. Doomed to die, because that was simply the truth. There was no cure for radium poisoning. There still isn't. Once the radium is in your bones, it stays there, and it keeps doing its damage until it kills you. These 5 women knew with absolute certainty that they were going to die, and die horribly, and that nothing the court could give them would change that. They were not fighting for their own lives. They knew those were already lost. They were fighting for accountability, for acknowledgement, for their families, and for every worker who would come after them. That is what makes their courage so staggering. When you have nothing left to gain for yourself, when you know you are going to die no matter what, and you choose to spend your last months of life in agony fighting a powerful corporation in a courtroom, that is a kind of heroism most of us will never be tested enough to match. And the physical reality of the trial was its own kind of horror. By the time the women had their first court appearance in January 1928, they were so sick that the scene was almost unbearable. 2 of them were bedridden. None of them could raise their arms high enough to take the oath. Let that image sit with you. These women came to court to testify, and they physically could not lift their hands to swear to tell the truth because the radium had so destroyed their bodies. Grace Fryer in her steel brace could barely move, and yet there they were, in court, facing down the corporation that had poisoned them, refusing to disappear quietly the way the company had hoped they would. And the press coverage changed everything, because for the first time, the public could see these women. Reporters described them in heartbreaking detail. One journalist wrote that Grace Fryer could tell you of the deaths of her friends without a flicker of an eyelash, because she had lived with the reality of her own death for so long that it no longer moved her. The women demonstrated the lip-pointing technique for the court, showing how they had been taught to put the brushes in their mouths. That image of these dying women calmly showing the simple, innocent action that had killed them ran in newspapers across the country, and America got angry. Here were young women, mothers and wives who had taken a respectable job and been rewarded with an agonizing death sentence. And here was a wealthy corporation that had known, that had lied, that had falsified science and hired investigators to smear them, and was now trying to run out the clock until they died. The public mood turned hard against the company. Newspaper columnists condemned the delay tactics. When the company requested another lengthy postponement, claiming their expert witnesses would be traveling in Europe over the summer, the outrage was enormous. People pointed out the obvious: the women might not live long enough for a delayed trial. The company was quite transparently trying to wait for the plaintiffs to die, and the public could see it. The pressure became intense, the story was everywhere, and the United States Radium Corporation, which had spent years confident that it could simply outlast and outspend a handful of dying factory workers, suddenly found itself losing the one battle it had never expected to fight: the battle for public opinion. They were being seen. The women they had treated as disposable had become front-page news, and the whole country was watching. And so, rather than face the disaster of a full public trial, the company decided it wanted to settle. And what happened in that settlement and in the cases that followed would echo through American law for the next century. The 1928 New Jersey settlement was, in some ways, a victory. Each of the 5 women received $10,000, a significant sum at the time, plus $600 a year for the rest of their lives and all their medical expenses paid. But here is the bitter truth about it. Many of the women used that settlement money to pay for their own funerals. The settlement did not save them. Nothing could. They won, and then they died, mostly within a few years. And the New Jersey case, as significant as it was, did not actually settle the legal question of whether a company could be held liable. Because they settled out of court, no binding precedent was set, which meant that when it happened again, and it did happen again in Ottawa, Illinois, the women there had to fight the entire battle over from scratch. And this is where we meet the woman whose story, for me, is the heart of this entire tragedy. Her name was Catherine Donahue. She worked for the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois. And she got sick the same way all the others did. The limping, the aching, the tooth loss, the tumor on her hip that grew to the size of a grapefruit. By the late 1930s, Catherine Donahue was dying. She weighed less than 70 pounds. She was so frail she could not leave her home. And yet, she became the lead plaintiff in the Illinois fight for justice, leading a group of women against the Radium Dial Company. The company in Illinois fought just as dirty as the one in New Jersey. They had closed down, reopened under a new name, moved operations, and used every legal trick available to avoid paying. Catherine and the other Ottawa women faced the same statute of limitations problems, the same delays, the same corporate machine designed to outlast them. But Catherine Donahue had decided that she was going to testify. Even though she was dying, even though she could barely move, she was going to make them listen. By the time of the final hearing in 1938, Catherine Donahue was too sick to travel to a courtroom. She was bedridden, weighing barely 60 pounds, in constant agony. So, the hearing came to her. They held it in her own home, in her little house in Ottawa, Illinois. Picture this: a commissioner sitting on furniture that was never meant for a legal proceeding, Catherine's husband, Thomas, beside her, his hands folded, and Catherine propped up against the pillows on her bedside, so wasted by the radium that she seemed almost to float, giving her testimony to a room crowded with lawyers and reporters. She described what had been done to her. She held up for the people in that room the very bones that had come loose from her own body, pieces of her jaw that she had kept. And she said something in that room that has echoed ever since. She said, quote, "It is too late for me, but not for you. It is too late for me, but not for you." A dying woman, 60 pounds, propped up in her own bed, using what little life she had left not to beg for herself, but to make sure it would not happen to anyone else. During the proceedings, at one point, Catherine collapsed. The great niece who knew her story later said that Catherine did not even have the energy left to cry out from the pain. She would just moan. And still, she testified. She won her case. The Illinois Industrial Commission ruled in her favor. The company, of course, appealed. They appealed again and again, all the way up toward the Supreme Court, still trying to escape responsibility. Catherine Donahue died on July 27, 1938, before she could see the final resolution. She fought literally to her last breath, and because she did, the courts upheld her victory. Together, the women in New Jersey and the women in Illinois had done something that had never been done before. They had forced powerful corporations to answer in law for what they did to the bodies of their workers. So, what did these women actually win? On the surface, the settlements look almost insulting. $10,000 and $600 a year for the New Jersey women, modest compensation for the Illinois women, much of which the company fought tooth and nail to avoid paying, even moving operations across state lines to dodge it. If you measure what the Radium Girls won purely in dollars, it looks like the corporations basically got away with it. But that is not where the victory was. Because what these women actually changed was the law itself, and not just one law, the entire principle underneath it. Before the Radium Girls, the legal reality for an American worker was brutally simple. If you took a job, you accepted the risk. If that job hurt you, that was your problem. There was almost no legal pathway for a worker to hold an employer responsible for an occupational disease, an illness caused slowly over time by the conditions of the work. Sudden accidents were one thing, but a disease that took years to show up? You had essentially no recourse. The company could poison you over a decade, and the law had nothing to say about it. The Radium Girls shattered that. Their cases established for the first time in a way that stuck, that a company could be held legally liable for occupational disease, that an employer had a duty to protect its workers from harm it knew about, that you could not knowingly poison your workforce and simply hide behind a statute of limitations and a stack of legal delays. The case forced changes to the statute of limitations itself, so that diseases with long latency periods, illnesses that take years to appear, could still be the basis for a claim. This is the legal DNA that runs directly into the creation of workplace safety law as we know it. When the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, was created in 1970, it was the institutional descendant of everything the Radium Girls had fought for. Before OSHA, around 14,000 Americans were dying on the job every single year. Today, even with a far larger workforce, that number has dropped by more than half. That reduction represents hundreds of thousands of lives saved over the decades. Lives saved because 5 dying women in New Jersey and a 60-pound woman testifying from her deathbed in Illinois refused to go quietly. And there is one more piece of legacy that is almost too poignant to believe. The research done on the Radium Girls, the studies of how radium settled in their bones, how radiation accumulated in the body over time, became foundational to radiation safety science. When the scientists of the Manhattan Project were building the atomic bomb during World War II, the man overseeing worker safety reportedly thought about the Radium Girls. He had a vision, he said, of the Ghost Girls, and it made him push for radiation protections for the thousands of workers handling radioactive material. The dial painters, in their suffering and their deaths, quite literally helped protect the workers who came after them, including the ones building the most powerful weapon in human history. Their poisoned bones taught the world how radiation kills slowly, and that knowledge has been protecting people ever since. Now, I want to tell you something about these women that sounds like it belongs in a horror film, except it is completely scientifically true. The Radium Girls are still radioactive. Right now, in their graves. Radium has a half-life of 1,600 years. That means it takes 1,600 years for just half of a given amount of radium to decay away. The radium that these women swallowed in the 1920s, the radium that settled into their bones and killed them, it is still there, still in their skeletons, still emitting radiation, and it will be for centuries. The women died nearly 100 years ago. The radium inside them has barely begun to fade. If you walk into certain cemeteries in New Jersey or in Ottawa, Illinois with a Geiger counter, the device that detects radiation, and you pass it over the graves of the dial painters, the counter will react. It will start to click. The ground itself, above where these women are buried, registers radioactivity. Their bones are still glowing 6 feet down, exactly as they glowed in life. When researchers exhumed the body of Marie Curie in 1927, 5 years after she died, the woman whose death certificate falsely blamed syphilis, her remains were tested. Her bones were still so radioactive that they exposed photographic film placed near them. The radium had killed her, been buried with her, and was still active years later, proving beyond any doubt what had really happened to her. Some of the women were buried in lead-lined coffins. Catherine Donahue was, because the people burying them understood that these bodies were, in a real sense, radioactive waste. Think about the full weight of that. These were young women. They wanted ordinary things, to marry, to raise children, to grow old. Instead, the glowing paint they once dabbed on their teeth as a joke turned their own skeletons into something that has to be buried in lead, and it made them, in the most literal possible way, unforgettable. You cannot erase them. You cannot hide what happened to them. The physical evidence is still in the earth, still ticking on a Geiger counter, and it will outlast every single person involved in covering it up by more than 1,000 years. There is a strange and terrible justice in that. The companies tried to bury this story, but the women themselves will be detectable, provable, undeniable for the next 16 centuries. The truth, quite literally, refuses to stop glowing. So here is the question that I always come back to with this story. Why don't more people know this? Because when you hear it fully, it is one of the most dramatic, enraging, important stories in modern history. It has everything. A miracle substance that turns out to be a poison, young women glowing in the dark, a corporate cover-up with falsified science, a courtroom drama with dying women testifying against the people who killed them, a legal earthquake that reshaped the rights of every worker in the country, and bodies that still glow in their graves a century later. This should be as famous as any story you learned in school. And yet, most people, when they first hear about the Radium Girls, have the exact same reaction. They say some version of, "How did I never know about this?" And the answer is layered. Part of it is simply that the victims were working-class women. History has a long habit of overlooking the suffering of women, and especially poor women. At the time, their pain was minimized, their symptoms misdiagnosed, their reputations attacked. As one historian put it, it took a man dying for an autopsy to even be performed to investigate radium as the cause. The women had been telling everyone they were being poisoned for years, and they were not taken seriously until the evidence became impossible to ignore. That pattern of women not being believed about what is happening to their own bodies is something a lot of people find painfully familiar even today. Part of it is that corporations have always had an interest in these stories being forgotten. The Radium Girls story is not a flattering one for the idea that companies can always be trusted to regulate themselves. It is a story about what happens when profit is allowed to matter more than human life, and about how hard ordinary people have to fight to force the powerful to do the right thing. That is not always a comfortable lesson, and comfortable lessons are the ones that tend to get taught. And part of it, honestly, is just that history is enormous, and the stories that get remembered are often the ones about kings and generals and battles, not about a group of factory women who changed the law from their deathbeds. But that is exactly why channels like this exist, because the Radium Girls matter. Not as a footnote, not as a curiosity, but as one of the most important things that ever happened to working people in this country. And the people who reduce them to a creepy fun fact, "Hey, did you know there were women who glowed in the dark?" are missing the entire point. These were real people, with names. Grace Fryer, Molly Magia, Catherine Schaub, Catherine Donahue. They deserve to be remembered fully, not as ghosts, as fighters. So what do we actually take from this? It would be comforting to think the story of the Radium Girls is purely a historical one, a relic of a less enlightened time, before we knew better, before we had safety regulations and worker protections and a scientific understanding of radiation. And in some ways, it is. You are not going to get a job painting watch dials with poison today, and if your employer tried to make you, you would have legal protections those women could only have dreamed of, protections they bought for you with their lives. But the deeper pattern in this story is not historical at all. The deeper pattern is this. A company discovers that something is profitable. They also discover, quietly, that it is harming people. And they make a calculation that the profit is worth more than the harm, and that they can manage, delay, or hide the consequences long enough to keep the money flowing. That calculation did not die with the Radium Girls. It is, unfortunately, one of the most repeated patterns in modern history. We have seen it with tobacco companies who knew their product caused cancer and buried the research for decades. We have seen it with lead, with asbestos, with opioids marketed as non-addictive, with chemical companies that knew they were poisoning water supplies. The specific poison changes, the calculation stays exactly the same. As one person reflecting on the Radium Girls put it, their methods have changed, but profit rules as it always has. That is the depressing truth, and that is precisely why this story still matters. Because the Radium Girls are not just victims to be pitied, they are a warning, and they are also a blueprint. They show us how this kind of harm happens, slowly, behind reassurances, hidden behind falsified science and legal delay. But they also show us how it gets stopped, not by the companies suddenly developing a conscience, not by the system correcting itself, but by ordinary people who refuse to be silenced, by a woman in a steel back brace who would not stop until she found a lawyer, by a 60-pound woman testifying from her deathbed, saying, "It is too late for me, but not for you." The next time someone tells you that regulations are just red tape, that companies can be trusted to look after their workers, that safety rules are an overreaction, remember the women who glowed in the dark. Remember that every protection you take for granted was written in someone's blood and fought for by people who knew they would not live to benefit from it. The Radium Girls used their last breaths to protect strangers they would never meet, people like you. The least we can do is remember them and refuse to let it happen again. That is the story of the Radium Girls. If it made you angry, good. That anger is exactly what they were counting on, because anger channeled into action, into vigilance, into refusing to look away, that is the thing that actually protects people. Drop the name of the woman who stayed with you most in the comments. Grace, Molly, Catherine, Catherine. Say their names, because being remembered is the one form of justice they can still receive. Subscribe if you want more history that they should have taught you and didn't, and I will see you in the next one.